Thanks to Hardin, and thank you very much for inviting me and coming to this talk. And since I wrote the introduction to the talk, I've been in Colombia. So I was there for 3.5 weeks, Colombia and Brazil. And I was lucky enough there to meet a completely different culture, one that was not predicated on logic, like our own, but in which there's still the indigenous story alive. And that story, we went to visit the Goethe Museum, which told the history of that ancient culture of Colombia. And everything in that culture was framed between darkness and light. So darkness, you can imagine, in relation to Hardin's talk, as decoherence, as things that have no meaning, as things that are a bit like the Brexit negotiations. I mustn't mention that. Going nowhere. And light is something that is coherent and has a form. So in this slide, this was the crowning of a new king. And this would happen on a lake where the king in waiting would be in exile. And he would travel this lake when it was his time to be king. And he would drop much gold into the lake as an offering to the darkness. And he would be painted in gold. And with the sunrise, he would appear to the people who would be around the lake. And they would, they would then accept him as their new leader. So the gold would signify identity and coherence. And this is what everything in the culture was framed within this greater story of darkness and light, decoherence and coherence, much like Hardin was intuiting in his talk. And I also gave a talk at the university, and it was amazing that there was a whole department of indigenous culture with this greater mythology of darkness and light underpinning the society. And this existed next to the Western science model of the university, which relied on solid facts of understanding, and the two just didn't meet, even though they were housed within the same university. So that's a kind of an extra perspective on darkness and light, and nothing and everything, which we're going to be exploring today. So also in India, there was this idea of emptiness and existence that goes back for thousands of years. So Indian mathematics and also Chinese mathematics knew the zero from thousands of years ago. And that was the basis of the decimal system that was used in India right from antiquity. And so that was very much like the story of darkness and light in the indigenous cultures of Colombia, that things had to go on a journey to become themselves. They had to find coherence out of the emptiness or the dissolution of darkness or the zero. And that was the journey of life through which everything went, and that man was part of that journey. He was not separate in his nature. But this approach was very different to Greece. So in Greece, there was no idea of the zero. In fact, everything was predicated on the one of existence. So Europe felt that its task was exploring existence for what it was in itself. And when Aristotle was told of the Indian decimal system, he completely rejected it, because he said, we don't need the zero. For us, the one is what is sacred. And it took many years. It wasn't until the 15th century or so that the decimal system we use of 0, 1, 2, 3 actually arrived in the West and was accepted by the church. So that's quite amazing that we think we're the inventors of science and mathematics, and yet it took so long for something as basic as the decimal system to arrive in the West. And one of the first people who started using this new mathematics and to lay the foundations of this new science was Isaac Newton. And Hardin referred a lot to the Newtonian system. And one of the, and to give a good example of what that Newtonian system was, this is one of the foundational experiments that Newton made into the nature of light. And Newton was somebody who would contemplate for a long time. He would spend 1 or 2 years thinking about a problem, and then he would have an intuition or an insight, and then with that insight he would do an experiment to try to test, is this theory I've thought right or wrong? And one of the things he tested was this idea of light. And that light, so he had a dark room, and he had a very small hole where the sunlight came in. And then he had a prism through which the light was diffracted. And the light split into different colours, especially red, green and blue. And when he put another prism to refract the different colours, the colours stayed the same, they didn't change. And Newton made the conclusion that actually light is made of colours, just like a building is made of bricks. He had the idea that red, green and blue are colours that make up light. And his theory was very revolutionary, because it implied that everything there is to know about light is actually contained in the elements that are within light. So you have a whole theory that's kind of complete in itself. It does not need any context for it to be applied or to work. And it's a very material type of understanding, because it says that light is something we can absolutely explain in a theory that is self-contained, that the colours are what make up light. And of course his theory has a lot of truth, because out of his theory there came Maxwell's theory of light, and that led to mobile telephones and X-rays and radio waves and many of the things that we use in technology. So Newton's theory and his way of trying to understand things was very powerful and has kind of formed and underpins our technological world. But often what he was saying was taken out of context, and it was forgotten that there was a dark surround, and it's presented that light is simply made up of colours, and that you can look up the wavelengths in an encyclopedia. There is nothing mysterious. There is nothing which one has to encounter to know about light. It's purely a knowledge which one can learn abstractly. And then in the about 100 years later, so Newton's theory of optics was 1710, Goethe, who was a German poet, and in the Romantic age, he was very unhappy with this abstraction of light and away from nature, as if life was nothing more than a series of theories. And he conducted a series of experiments that were quite different to Newton's. So his starting point was not to start with a theory and then do an experiment to test the theory. Rather, his starting point was to look at the phenomena itself. And from the result, from how he saw light and darkness behaving, he would conduct new experiments and thereby try to through the experiments, to get a sense of darkness and light as something that he was encountering. So he did not start with the theory, he started with the phenomena themselves. And And in particular, one of the experiments he did was a kind of complementary one to that of Newton. Instead of having a slit through which the sunlight went, and then darkness all around, he did exactly the same experiment, but reversed, with darkness at the centre, and then light all around, and again the light would pass through a prism and go onto a screen. But he changed around that instead of having a light centre and darkness around, he now had the opposite. He had light with a dark centre. And what happened when he did the experiment, so he did exactly the same experiment as Newton, was that he got a different set of primary colours, a different set of colours, a different spectrum that appeared when he did the experiment. And so he had yellow, cyan and magenta instead of blue, green and red as the primary colours. And he could use Newton's exact argument to say that, as Newton said, that colour originated in the sunlight, Goethe could, if he used that same reasoning, would say that these colours originated in the darkness, because the light pinpoint through which these colours were produced was now a dark centre through which these colours were produced. And this set up a complete debate and a tension between Goethe and Newton's theories of light, because it seemed like Goethe had completely shaken the foundations on which Newton was arguing what light was. And often people argued, well, Newton is obviously right, because so many technological implications follow from it. But it seemed like Goethe had completely taken away the ground on which Newton was basing his theory. And there's a complementarity between these two pictures. So if you actually measure the colours, then there's an energy in the colours. There's something material about them. They're building light out of darkness, and there's an energetic quality to the colours. Here, the colours are a softening of the light. So there's a negative energy in these colours. So there's a complete complementary quality to these two views, and so it's very perplexing. How do they relate to each other? And which theory is right? Is Goethe's theory right, or is Newton's theory right? And so does anybody want to say what this colour brings up in them, what feeling? Warmth. Yeah. Anything else? Warmth?
Something can hurt, breathing or something.
Bleeding? Yeah.
Blood?
Huh?
Blood?
Blood, yeah.
So like body cells.
Body cell.
Not body cells, but like the veins and
Yeah. Okay, and how about this next one? All right.
Calm.
Calm.
Water.
Water.
cold.
Cold.
It looks quite hot actually.
Yeah.
It looks like gas.
Gas.
Sky.
Sky.
Suffocation.
What was that?
Suffocation.
Suffocation. So Goethe got attracted to colour because he went to visit these museums in Rome, and he understood that colour had a quality that was emotive. It was communicating something. it was not just that colour was some kind of mechanical quality that you could look up in an encyclopedia and you would know what it was. It was that colour was communicating something about experience. And this kind of fitted with what he'd found with his spectrum. That it was not that colour simply built something up energetically and materially. Colour also had this quality of surrender. And that it was able to express a nature through itself. That was something more than just that it was the medium to express something more than itself, to express the light, to express the coherence in its relation to the decoherence. So Goethe said he questioned Newton's idea that darkness is just the absence of light, and that all one had to worry about was the nature of light, and the darkness didn't matter. And he said that, so you can read that quote. And Goethe instead says that darkness and light are like the two poles of a magnet, and that the darkness affects the light, and the light can limit the energy of the darkness, and in both cases colour arises. So Goethe is saying that that underpinning our world is this story of darkness and light, and that and that colour is mediating that story of darkness and light. So if we look at this picture of Paris, the Sacré-Cœur, then we can see that the colour is communicating something. So we can see that the sun is just rising on the church, and that the church, that there's something holistic being communicated about the quality that that the light is bringing, and so the red is the warmth of the sun rising, and the blue is the cold, the shadow, through which out of which this church is expressing its a unity. Can everybody feel that quality? So there was this big debate about which theory is right, Goethe's theory or Newton's theory. And more recently, the question has been raised, well, what if both Goethe and Newton were both right? Is it possible that they were both very careful individuals, they both did their experiments painstakingly, and is it possible that their experiments are both right, but they're indicating a different quality about existence? And so that if we look at this picture, there's both a holistic sense to it. There's both a sense of something, of a quality being communicated, and at the same time, we know that the red and the blue are just wavelengths. They're just material aspects of light and dark. So can it be that both these aspects are true and are represented through colour? And the way one can make both of these perspectives true is quite linked to what Hardin was saying about quantum theory, because in quantum theory, as we saw, there's no underpinning reality. If you look at which slit the particle is going through, you change the outcome of the experiment. There's no underlying single material reality in which we can place quantum theory. And similarly, if both Newton and Goethe are true, then we have to abandon the idea that there's one explanatory material layer on which all of physics is built. We have instead to say that there are many possible ways of engaging with the world, and that the nature of colour is to allow all these different perspectives. And so the world can communicate to us in different ways. It can communicate to us as the individual nature of the different colours, or it can communicate to us the whole quality of something greater than ourselves, which is being born through the world and that we are receiving. So we can say that both are true. Both are true, Newton and Goethe's perspectives, and that the world we live in is not something that's materially founded in one way of seeing the world. Rather, the world we're in is a kind of journey from the decoherence of darkness to the coherence and the identity of light. So here's Turner, who worked with Goethe's colours to draw, and this is his evening of the deluge, and of darkness, and of decoherence, and of nonsense, and of chaos. And then he did another painting, Light and Colour, the morning after the deluge, Moses writing the book of Genesis, which is saying about the coherence of the world, the identity of the world, that even though we go through darkness, even though we go through decoherence, and that's the nature of light and life, it's also the nature of life that it has its destiny, it has its identity, it has its coherence. And just as the indigenous Colombians were speaking about that journey from darkness to light, so it's also the essence of our journey, is to travel from a world that doesn't make sense, that has many different threads, into something that's where we encounter something whole, we encounter something in which we belong, we encounter something coherent. So this was Goethe's journey, to put the colours together into this wheel, where the nature of colour is something that's alive. It's not something that's dead, as Newton had said. And the colours aren't divided from one another. Their nature is to go round. So here you have the green, the red, and the blue of Newton, and the yellow, the cyan, and the magenta of Goethe's, these two spectrum, but they're united, and that they allow this journey of darkness and light to be expressed through the medium of the world, through the medium of colour, through the medium of nature. And so we always have this circular play in holistic science, where the whole appears through the parts, and the parts are identified in the whole. And so just like in the Tao, or in many indigenous societies, there is this need to engage with both aspects of the world, both the holistic aspect and the detailed aspect. And only then will we come to engage with the true nature of the world, when we don't treat the world just as